Right. So when did you switch to when did you move back to Miami?
Middle of December. Like I barely got out of California before the stay-at-home order. I like made it out by like a week. So it was like the middle of December when things started to get really bad in California. So it was I guess good timing to bounce
Oh,
back
definitely.
down
Yeah.
here.
You jump ship right as soon as you needed to.
Yeah, man. Yeah. It was crazy time.
Yeah, whereabouts were you living in LA before you moved?
I was downtown pretty much the whole time I lived there, um, downtown LA,
Yeah.
and it was
I'm
great. I really
Yeah, I was
liked
gonna
it.
say I'm assuming that it was fantastic for a minute there.
Yeah, it was, and I got there in uh, like 2014, and so it was just like starting to kind of um, get blow up down there. So it was cool. I mean, it was cool to see my neighborhood kind of grow and stuff, but it was a good time to be in LA for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, there was a sweet spot there for quite a bit.
Yeah, and that was one of I was living in Oakland before that, and that was one of the reasons I like got and ended up in LA was because it was it seemed to be thriving artistically and musically, like the music scene. So when I moved to LA, it was great. Really good creative energy, and played a lot of shows when I first moved there. It was really refreshing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was a lot of spots to hit, like both
Yeah,
smaller and bigger. Yeah, there's a large gambit. Yeah, definitely. But were
yeah.
you originally from Miami? Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up here. I grew up here, and but I left right after high school. Um, so and didn't really, I appreciate much more coming back here. Mostly the natural nature, and which I took, I thrived in as a kid, but definitely took for granted. And so since I've been back, that's basically I've just been either on the coast, mostly on the coast. And, I'm like 10 minutes from the beach. And then if I go 40 minutes west, I'm like in the Everglades essentially. So I've been hanging out with manatees and alligators the last couple of weeks. It's been great.
It's a good group to surround yourself with. Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a yin and yang. Like the manatees are super friendly and lovable creatures, and alligators are a little prehistoric, a little aggressive.
Just a bit
So
more.
it's
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, like last week I was in the Everglades. I've been recording, field recording mainly, and so that's been awesome. That's to be back down here, and also just focusing more on music than I was able to the last couple of years in LA.
Yeah, definitely. What kind of stuff were you getting into as a kid down there?
I mean, I was I my family's house was on a lake, so I was a lot, I was fishing as a kid and playing around with snakes and um just crazy wildlife that like I didn't really like when I once I was like out of there and much older, I look back, I was like, yeah, it was like, and there'd be alligators in the lake like once a year. And so it was mainly I was playing a lot of sports too. 'Cause, in South Florida, it's a very it's very Latin American, so soccer is really big. So I was playing soccer as a kid, and picked up Spanish, learned Spanish from playing soccer essentially. And so that's that. When I was a kid, that's what I was mainly focused on, was like the outdoors and sports, mainly soccer.
Yeah. So not too much trouble, getting into.
No, no, and kept me super busy, and was great. I miss it.
Yeah, definitely. You I once you get out of that age bracket, like high school,
Yeah,
you kind of don't get to experience that, like that group mentality of playing a sport.
yeah. I mean, fortunately, like I got like right. my senior year of high school, junior and senior year, I started getting in. I mean, I've always been into music, but I started getting into art, visual art, and music quite a bit. And so when I got out of high school, my whole brain shifted from like like being an athlete in sports to focusing on art and music. It was pretty dramatic shift. One I'm grateful
Oh
for
yeah,
sure.
that's a change for sure. Yeah, in a good
Yeah,
direction. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It was good. It was good.
What kind of bands were playing around there when you were younger?
I was well, you know, like it was very is isolated in terms of bands touring, you know, being on tour. So because like in South Florida, it's so you know remote that bands would oftentimes would bypass it because you know to go from like you know the South, you'd have to go like 8 hours to get down to like Miami. So you know it was hard to catch a lot of good bands coming through, but there was definitely like a very specific music scene in Miami at the time. I wasn't really playing music at all back then. I was like friends with all the my you know my friends were in all the bands. I was the friend you know who would go to all the shows. And in Miami at the time, we're talking early, early to mid '90s. It was very much an indie rock kind of pop scene, very much in line with like the band Unrest and stuff like that. And so it was, you know, a lot of you know this was like the late early '90s, so it was pretty you know grunge was happening, taking over. So that's kind of what started. You know that was the sound at first, but then it kind of got more pop influenced, actually, like indie pop. Um, very like happy, and I mean it's you know made sense. It's like you know the beaches and the sun, and lends itself to that sound.
Definitely. I mean, like, yeah, that really seems like that's an influence. I mean, with any place really that experiences that, and even on the flip side of that being like Seattle and like just rain and
Right.
dreariness. Yeah, I mean, like, yeah,
Right.
weather really impacts what kind of sound is made.
Yeah. And I think like you know the like I remember going to in ninth grade, the big concert was Guns N' Roses in Miami, but Soundgarden was opening. So this was like 19 aging myself, 1991 maybe. And seeing Soundgarden, like, you know, Soundgarden, no one knew who Soundgarden was. They got booed off the stage, but I was like, that was my introduction to that band and that type of music. So, you know, so, you know, those huge bands would make it down, but not like, you know, the kind of bands like, you know, I don't know, Pavement or, you know, that kind of thing.
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah. So it's definitely like an indie kid in the, you know, in the 90s, and didn't really get into electronic music until I moved to New York after college and was interning at a couple record labels, one of which was Beggar's Banquet. And they were, I think, distributing the label Too Pure, which introduced me essentially to electronic music with Stereolab and Mouse on Mars, which became like my two favorite bands. So, and that's kind of when things shifted for me. But definitely was started off as a indie rock, which I think a lot of people were. It was the '90s, you know.
Yeah, definitely. So did you move from Miami straight to New York, or where did you go to
No, I
college?
went to college in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which was about 2.5 hours outside of New York City and about an hour and a half outside of Philly. So I was going to, you know, on the weekends, I would go to New York a lot, and moved to New York after college. So I got there in '97, I think, right? You know, pre Williamsburg, pre Brook, you know, before Brooklyn really blew up. Um, so that, you know, it was an interesting time there as
Yeah.
well.
How much was rent when you first moved there?
Man, I like the apartment, the studio apartment I was living in. I was living in the East Village, Second Avenue, 13th, in between 13th and 14th Street, which was actually like 3 blocks from where I was born, oddly enough. And I just wonder what, you know, what my studio apartment is worth now. I couldn't even fathom how much it would be to rent today.
Thousands for sure, right?
Several thousand, easily.
Yeah. So how long did you spend in New York?
I was there for about, I lasted 3 years or so, like a little more than 3 years. I just got out of school. I was in my early 20s, didn't really know what I was doing or what I wanted to do. And, I felt at a time like everyone should like live in New York at least once, even for a year, but maybe not in your early 20s when you don't really know what you want to be doing. The city can swallow you up, which I mean, I benefit. I went to so many great concerts, and really, that's kind of where my musical life sort of blossomed. Because I was interning and working at labels. And I was working,
Multiple labels, like more than
yeah,
bouncing around.
I interned at Beggar's Banquet, which was awesome. And although, till this day, again, this was like 1997, so it was like Radiohead and Spiritualized were playing at Radio City Music Hall.
Wow.
And every like the label's friends with those guys, so everybody in the office got to go except the lonely intern. So that was traumatic. But I was interning there, and I interned at Astralworks, which is where wasn't getting paid. I got paid in promos, so Air was like that. Air's first album was coming out, so Astralworks was a subsidiary of Caroline Records. So there were a lot of cool bands on Caroline at that time. And then I eventually got a job at a jazz label that I worked at for a couple of years, like a straight ahead jazz label, but had a cool reissue label that I was really into that like reissued like Edith Piaf and Django Reinhardt and weird, French cabaret music from from that period. So that was pretty cool too, but I wasn't making any music really. That's actually where I started to like experiment with computer programs at the time, and was like saw the this was like again like the late 90s. So that whole world was just starting to kind of open up, and so that's kind of where I entered the music making fray, so to speak.
Yeah, you're really on the cusp of the internet thing. Really, right? I mean,
I'm
yeah.
very old. Yes.
No,
Yes.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying
No,
that
no,
you're on
it's
the
fine.
forefront of it.
When I
Listen,
was in
you're old, Greg.
college,
You're old. That's it.
it's
I'm saying
happening,
it.
man.
I'm
It's
saying
happening. It's true. Um, I remember, in college, and my friends would be in the computer lab. I'd be like writing a paper. I'm like, oh, hey, what are you doing? They're like, oh, I'm on the internet. I'm like, well, what do you, they're like, yeah, I'm on like Rolling Stone. And I'm like, well, I don't understand. Why don't you just get the magazine? I did not understand why, or, they would be on the internet. At the time it was like email, and that was barely a thing. So yes, I was definitely on the cusp. And it's weird because I've been teaching college students for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And just seeing what they're growing up with. It's interesting to see how it's all going to shape them, as they move into their later years as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, because I mean, you were on. I mean, you were a bit older when it was kind of surfacing, and then they're
Yeah.
just, and I
Yeah,
myself is just like it's always been. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like couldn't figure out like a need for it, and I was trying to, at the time, and yeah, until like I think around like the like late 90s, 99 or so was when I was like, oh, okay, I get it. But when it was first out there, it was like, yeah, I don't see how this is useful for me. But clearly things changed.
It's just definitely, yeah, a major
Wow.
shift. When did you first get your first computer that you had in an apartment or whatever?
Well, like in college, I had like a Apple, which laptop to write papers and stuff. But like the Apple brand back then was somewhat like of a, maybe like not taken seriously. And so I was a PC, and a PC desktop, and started using some programs. Like they were basically drum machines, and I had used like hardware drum machines and learned how to program drum machines. I was actually like, so since I knew how to do that, the software was just virtually the same, but literally virtual drum machines and sequencers. And so that was kind of like the bridge there. And it was a PC. And right around that time, I left New York because it kind of chewed me up and spat me out. I was in my early 20s. I left when I was about 24. Ended up back in Florida for a couple of years, about 2 years, and that's in that window was when I started taking. I was like really start. It was it. I would say, I mean, like, it's a cliche, but being kind of a lost soul at the time and not really having a place, like being like music gave me a you know gave me everything really. And that's kind of where it took off. And was like, oh, I think I might be able to take this seriously. I mean, I was doing it in my bedroom, and for me, and I handed to some of my friends, and that was great, and that's all I really needed out of it. And so that's how it all started. And I went to my first like a show, because there's in late 90s, early 2000s in Miami, there's a label called Schematic Records, which is still around and still active and doing cool stuff. But that kind of, was like early IDM, like very much Autechre, in the Autechre vein. And that's where like the electronic music, and it was all beat driven, like very polyrhythmic, disjointed, insane beats, to the point where I like would go to shows, and I became friends with some of those guys, and just was like, I don't need to make beats. Like they've got it covered, and what they're doing was so interesting and fascinating to me. I was like, I'm gonna not use any beats. And that's kind of how I got into ambient music, essentially.
Yeah. Was there anything that you were listening to prior to that you're like, I really dig this, that there's, I mean, it's
I mean,
yeah, ambient
absolutely music. I mean, it's funny, like people would assume I was, if you were in ambient music at that time, you were listening to Brian Eno, which I think I was familiar with, and I might have had music for airport, one of the volume music for airports, but it certainly wasn't like, I'm going to do that. It was more like many of us, like Aphex Twin selected ambient works. And so the music I was making was in that vein. And it's some of those tracks are ambient, but a lot of them have like, 4/4, beats in it. And so that's kind of as far as like me using beats went, but I was using like a 4/4, very slow, not danceable. Well, I guess you could nod your head to it. Head nodding music.
That's what you want to see when you look out into the crowd. You're like, oh yeah, they're listening.
Absolutely. Definitely. No. Like when. Yeah, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say, like if you're playing the show and you look up and you see that, it's definitely a great feeling, and you've got them locked in.
Yeah, and you kick people out for like truly dancing, right? Like none of that here.
Yeah, right. Well, it's like more like in the later years, I had a project called Date Palms, and like we would play. We were in the Bay Area at the time, and sometimes we'd go to play shows, and you'd be in bars, and people would be like drinking and talking, and we would start, and sometimes get heckled, and just go into it. And then like 5 minutes in, and I just kind of forget everybody's around. 5 minutes in, look up, and those people that were like either being loud and obnoxious or heckling you, or like bobbing their head, you're like, yeah, that's what's up.
That's why that was the best time. Yeah,
that was the best. That was a really great feeling. And as far as like live performance goes, which I as far as that was more of a band, and I didn't really do that kind. I wasn't a like band performer. I was mostly a solo performer.
Sure.
For a while.
Definitely. When did that transition? When did you move into working with and starting Date Palms?
Well, just to continue this like my
Please,
early
please go
musical
ahead.
discovery. I was in Florida for those 2 years, kind of recovering from my New York days, and ended up in Barcelona. I was taking some classes to teach English, and then I ended up just staying there because I realized if I go back where I was, I'm not ever going to leave because it just became really comfortable, too comfortable. So I stayed in Barcelona, and I've been very lucky, like where I've moved, and I moved around a lot back in the day, like every 3 years or so. And every time I would move, I like either coincidentally or I kind of in the back of my head saw that something was going on there. I would end up in a really good moment in time where something, the music and art scene was thriving. And that was the case in Barcelona in early 2000s. I was there 2000 to 2004, and the Sonar Festival was there. And there was, oh man, a couple experimental electronic albums that were more, I don't, for lack of a better term, avant-garde or less straight ahead electronic music, and more like left field. And that really, for whatever reason, that's what I that was drawn to, was like the weirder stuff that may not have like a formulaic structure kind of thing. And that's when I started to play shows. I'm laughing because I think the first show I played in Florida, I went to a show and people had their desktop computer. They were playing on their desktop computers at a bar, dive bar. And it kind of blew my mind. I was like, I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know people were doing that. So I played my first show down here on my desktop computer. But then, the laptop, that Apple PA Pismo, I think it was, the black. That's what I got into. And but I ended up in Barcelona for that time, and that's where I started like performing in Barcelona first, but then started performing around Europe, and really kind of grew up as a performer during that period of time.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, that really changed. So when you got there, how old are you? Mid 20s?
I was, yeah, exactly. I was mid 20s, and I felt, that was probably the first time where in my life where I was like, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and it felt really good, and felt like I know who I am now, and it was really refreshing, and really great time. And I just had, it was a great experience. Yeah, it was just such a good time to be there. People from all over Europe were like, it was really cheap. I was like living in a flat for like 300 euros, a really nice flat in Barcelona.
What's that in American money?
At the time it was almost like, similar. It's like, the euro was similar to the dollar back then. So it was like $300, $400
For quite a big space.
Yeah, I had like a two bedroom flat. And so, yeah, that was amazing. So because it was so affordable, everybody from Europe, producers, music makers, artists, just kind of converged. And so like every weekend, it felt like there was a music festival or an art festival, and got to play in a couple, and got to play in these amazing spaces, got to like meet artists that from Europe that were big influences on me. And it was awesome. It was a really good time to be there. And then as it started to get more expensive, that's when everybody left and moved to Berlin. And that's when Berlin kind of became the hub for all things, electronic music, electroacoustic music, improvisation. Berlin was the spot because it was so affordable back then. 2004, 5, 6. Until where now it's no longer the case. Berlin's got really expensive, so yeah, it was just a good time to be in Europe, I think, because things were happening in the US, certainly, like a lot of labels out of San Francisco and California, but for the type of music I was doing, like Europe was a good spot to be.
Definitely.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
So you moved to Berlin as well for a time?
No, I thought about it, but no, I ended up like around at 2004. I had a roommate who was thinking about, who I'm still friends with, and also producer, and he's in Brooklyn. And he was thinking about going back to school for music, and he was getting like, you know, brochures and stuff from programs sent to the apartment. And at the time I was like reading The Wire a lot, you know, which was like you know, an education in like avant-garde music, which, you know, exposed me, you know, it was a great learning vehicle. And I started to see this place, Mills College, a lot in the articles, a lot. It was weird. And then I got this brochure, and it was just for grad school. And so my roommate was like, hey, check this out. And I was thinking of going to grad, like applying to school in Barcelona. There's a really cool program, multimedia master's program. But he gave me this brochure, and it was Mills College for a degree in electronic music, and recording media was the title of the degree. And I started reading it, and I was like, I didn't even know you could go to school for this stuff. And it kind of cracked my brain open, and I applied. And I was still, you know, I wasn't classically trained. I played piano as a kid, but mostly by ear. And so I didn't have the classically trained background. Didn't really have an engineering background. I was all self-taught. I'd reached a point where I feel like I have an aesthetic and a sound I've developed, but like I didn't really have any sense of like composition per se, other than like, you know, building up a track and this was the score basically for everything,
Right.
you know, right, Dropout,
Yeah.
which lends itself to ambient music. But you know, I knew there's more and to that, and I wanted to study composition and learn from some of the masters, really, and got to do so. And I left Barcelona in 2004 to move to Oakland, representing.
Yeah. We're gonna put that in there just so people
Great
know.
Great music store, Stranded in Oakland.
Repping it.
Repping it.
They're proud sponsor of this podcast. So.
Sorry.
No. Yeah, no.
Product placement.
I had to do it like legality. Like I have to work it in somehow. Oh, okay. So I'm just glad that you did it organically, because usually it's so forced. So yeah.
Yes. Well, we talked about it earlier, but we'll keep it on the down low.
Yeah.
That's how I ended up in California. I had no intention of ever, the sun's coming out, living in California. I was afraid of California, having grown up like as far away from it, you know. So I ended up in Oakland, and went to school there, and it blew my mind, and really did a lot for me artistically, especially compositionally, but also collaborating with just amazing musicians and open musicians, and open to do non-traditional scores and stuff like that, which I certainly wasn't writing traditional scores. They were more like instructions and images kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I got to study with Alvin Curran, Pauline Oliveros, Maggie Payne, Terry Riley visited there. Got to play him a track, and he invited us to his studio, and was introduced to like tempuras at that time, because he had a whole bunch of tempuras. I was getting into Indian classical music. Pandit Pran Nath was a professor there in the early 80s, like 81, I think. So just the history of that place, and the people who've gone through there, the professors I got to study with, and the people I went to school with, all helped shape what I'm doing today.
Yeah, I mean, and so you looked at that as like a very integral part of like, okay, like this is how I should be doing this. And I mean, so that school really paved a way for you to like, oh, I should be doing more of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I got to like have a 25-person ensemble perform a piece that I made, electronically, that I transposed for an acoustic ensemble to perform. And I got to conduct, which was
Wow.
really, really intimidating. And might have crapped my pants during the performance. Very intimate, you know, I had to like act like I knew what I was doing in front of, you know, classically trained musicians. And Fred Frith was integral in helping me with that piece, I should mention, because I wouldn't have even probably thought of doing that piece. And that, you know, gave me confidence. It was like, oh, I can do that. Like, you know, it worked, and it was a very simple system and process that I developed that it was able to kind of take that and use it in other contexts. So it was very instrumental in just like, you know, giving somebody who doesn't have any classical background confidence to do that kind of work.
And you said it was a 25 piece ensemble?
Yeah, it was a little like definitely over the top.
Wow.
It wasn't like I'm writing a piece and I need 25 musicians to play it. It was more like the ensemble had 25 musicians, you know, with traditional instruments, but also, you know, instruments that were not traditional in a Western ensemble like koto and shakuhachi. Those were two that I remember off the top of my head. But, you know, had a whole like string section of viola, violin, a couple cellos, two pianos. It was incredible. And nothing I've done, I don't think anything I've done musically has eclipsed that experience. Funny thing about that is, you know, it was it was a thesis performance, so I had to do it to finish the program, and all of those are recorded. And this neat, you know, we recorded some of the rehearsals, which was cool. You can kind of hear where it started and how it developed. But on that night of the performance, somebody forgot to hit record. Which ended up being a blessing in disguise, because when you have people in the audience coughing and stuff, doesn't lend itself well to a recording. So fortunately, I was able to get the ensemble to perform it again in the concert hall with no one in there. So it was a much better recording environment. We were able to, you know, capture, I think, as good of a performance as we did on the night of the actual performance.
Yeah.
So
and it's good because there's no one else there, obviously, as you said. I mean, it really lends itself to just the music, not the reaction.
Yeah, because there'll be people coughing, like, you know, that get uncomfortable or nervous. Like I went to a Merce Cunningham, John Cage performance at Stanford, I think. And, you know, people have season tickets to that kind of thing that go to those shows regardless of if they know, you know, that are older, that just go to that kind of thing. And, you know, people started coughing and like, cause they were uncomfortable because it was very sparse and minimal. And it was crazy. I'd never experienced anything like that. Which I guess is like kind of how John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds really kind of comes from that place of the audience discomfort and confusion, where the audience becomes the piece, you know, and their sounds and their sighs and their like coughing and they're like what is, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, very experimental. I mean, to that 10th degree, even getting the audience involved. Yeah. So how hard was it to articulate what you wanted from a certain section in regard to your own piece, and then that transition? Was it difficult? I mean, how long did it take to process that? It's like, okay, I want these violas to do this, the violin to do this,
you know,
this piano player to do that.
Looking back, I had very little time to work with the ensemble. I think we only had like 3 or 4 4 rehearsals tops. And the first one was like, you know, I couldn't conduct. I was going to conduct, and I didn't, and you know, I had to be talked into it, and was glad I was, because it was such a cool experience. Obviously, I wasn't conducting traditionally. The music was not set to, you know, bars and beats, and you know, so in that regard, it was very open. Which is, you know, when I make electronic music and I perform, it's not, you know, half of it's structured and about half of it isn't. So there's a freedom to move around. How long sounds are there for, when they come in, when they come out is all in the moment, like how I'm hearing it. And during the performance, and that kind of became my system really. And I was able to use that same system that I used when I would make electronic music to use with the ensemble. So I broke the ensemble up into, I think, it was an electronic track that was built off of like 8 loops. And, those loops had some of the, there was like trumpet, I think that might have been, piano. Those might have been the only 2 acoustic instruments I used. Maybe melodica, but it was mostly electronic sine waves and electronic sources. And originally, intuitively, I'm like, oh, the whole ensemble has to be playing at the same time, which was just ended up sounding like a mess. So I had to realize, oh, it could break them up into like sections, and different sections play at different times, and a lot of some sections are going to be overlapping. So since I had about 8 loops in the electronic music, I had about 6 to 8 sections of the ensemble that are like broke up into, and it wasn't like this is the string section group and this, it was like a mix of instruments. And I was just able to trigger which group to start playing when to stop, whether to get louder or quieter. And and it was awesome. And it was funny because I don't have the background, and so I'd be having like people who musicians who play acoustic instruments that can only get to a certain amplitude. I'd constantly be telling them to get louder, and they'd look at me like, it doesn't go any louder, man. So I'd get
There's
these
no
looks.
amp on this. Yeah, that's just
or like thinking about things like reed players need to occasionally breathe. That what because I'm using sustained tones. So it was like that's having overlapping parts happening was necessary. So it was a great learning experience working with other musicians and acoustic instruments, which I had done sparingly here and there. I'd use like a piano or a trumpet, but didn't never really work with like a string quartet or anything until I was in school. So when I did that, I was like, okay, everything I do from now on is going to be like that type of work. And I found out like very shortly after, when I finished school, like trying to pull that off like outside of a academic context where people have to show up to rehearsal, they're told when the rehearsal is, to like, hey, trying to get like all these musicians, can you and like trying to get like 4 musicians in a room at the same time was like really difficult. So it was just not practical. And I kind of was like, I'm going to do that again. Once I have the opportunity or funding or, grant to pull that kind of thing off, I don't need 25 musicians, like 9 to 12 would work. And so it's still there. I still have that system. It's, and I still want to perform, compose for that type, for chamber music and ensembles, because it's not something I do regularly. And so it's really rewarding.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is like, a very few amount of people get to even do that, let alone, really perform it and everything. Like that's crazy. That's quite insane. And the performers themselves, because you said that there was a little bit of like wiggle room within it. It wasn't like super tightly structured. You come in here and here. Was that hard for them to understand? It's like, okay, there's not like a structure. There's structure, but it's not like concrete.
A lot of them came from jazz and improvisation. So they were like, they were totally into it, but then if you had somebody classically trained, they need like notation and they need a system. And my system was very simple, and I didn't want to give them notation because I didn't need, it was like 4-note patterns that they're just playing. And and they have the freedom, like how loud or quiet, to change like amplitude, but it was really just like 4-note patterns. So it's very simple. And like there were a couple, there's some pushback where I had one saxophone player be like, I'm not used to I usually do more than just play these 4-note patterns, and they were upset about it. They wanted, and I was like, I don't like know what to say. That's what we need. And that I had to learn how, you know, it was definitely a learning interpersonal dynamics, what working with an ensemble. So it was, you know, learning experience from that end as well. But in general, you know, for that type of program, people are generally open for whatever. Which was, and in the Bay Area, like as an audience, the audience is open for whatever. And that's why at the time it was like really great to be in the Bay Area, because you could try shit out and not have to worry about like getting, you know, you know, or just people being obnoxious. And that, you know, people were open to anything at that time. And that was really freeing, which led me to like my next body of work, which was tape chants, which I would never have thought of. Like, I had this idea where I wanted to get away from the laptop as an instrument because I felt beholden to it, and spent like 2 years trying to come up to develop another system of being able to perform. And so I realized that what I'm doing on the computer, I can do with like tape cassettes and put loops on cassettes instead of using like software. And my friend at the time, Ben Bracken, who just put out an amazing record with his partner, Ashley. And you know, he lived in this warehouse space in Oakland called the Mind Gaze, and I almost had like a little residency there because, you know, I could just go there and either like play a show or practice. And I just brought all these cassette players over, and I'm like, I'm going to try this thing out. I didn't even practice it at my space before I did it, and I just like put loops on the tapes, and the cassette players all had their own speaker. So I was able to set them up around a space and then go on and like turn each one on and like develop the piece. And so it was, that was also a really great experience, because it made me, I felt like, okay, I don't have to use a laptop to make music. And it was a different means of performing. It was somewhere between like a performance and performance art, because like I'm going around and I'm kind of listening, and I'm walking to the different players, knowing what's on the loops and deciding. It wasn't structured as which one do I play first, second, third, fourth, fifth. I was like in the moment, which is like how I would perform with a laptop. And it became this it became this thing where like I'm sitting there thinking like, which one do I want to play next? And like you could see me like trying to figure it out in my head, and like people are standing, I like bump into people, I like trip over something. And so it like created this tension. But also I think people responded to it so well because it was like a different type of performance, where you're not like looking at somebody on stage necessarily, like wasn't a traditional like performance, like. And it was like electroacoustic because I'm setting these players up around, and it was almost like lo-fi surround sound. Of course cassettes were, you know, lo-fi, our lo-fi, so to speak. And so yeah, that was like my next big discovery. And I basically performed that piece for like the next 4 years in different iterations. I had about like 4 different compositions that I could like swap out tapes from one composition, use it in this one, because I could pitch all the cassette tapes. There's like a pitch wheel on the players and a half speed switch. So I could like tune all the tapes to each other. And that was another part of it, was like the tuning systems that I used. Or without that, I don't think the piece, the music and the performance wouldn't have hit as hard if it was just a bunch of electronic sounds happening at the same time. But all the tapes were like tuned to each other, so it created like this really nice drone that just kind of moved around, and depending on the space that I was performing in, it would change dramatically based on the acoustics of the space and how many people are there. And so it was awesome. It was exciting for me because I never really knew what I was like on it every time. I was like, it may work, it may not. And there's something very exciting about that.
Definitely.
and got to perform it.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Please. I was going to ask, was it, and you were just playing it through the speaker itself on the machine itself? Okay. Gotcha. So you weren't
So
amplifying
it lent it.
Gotcha.
Right. It would lend itself to like smaller spaces. And so I did a lot of art galleries. I took it on tour in Europe to at some point, but like if I did do it on larger scale where I would like mix, I would have some of the tape players around the audience, but then I'd also like put some of the tapes through the PA. So it'd be like a mix.
Wow. Yeah.
And then I got to also do it on a bigger scale than that at the Berkeley Art Museum with my friend Paul Clipson, who invited me. He's a visual artist filmmaker. He passed away a couple of years ago, unfortunately, and he invited me to perform with him that piece, and he was going to screen his Super 8mm films and his 16mm films, where it's a lot of his stuff is improvised because he has the projectors and he's in real time kind of changing stuff up, and so am I, sonically. And so and he's using like sort of an outdated aesthetic being Super 8, and I'm using an outdated aesthetic being cassette tapes. And so he invited me to perform with him at the Berkeley Art Museum, which was having performances there over the summer. And it's a huge cavernous space. And I was like, how is this even going to work? Because it's so big. And we would go to performances there where people would play these quiet pieces and it would just get lost in this huge cavernous, like Bauhaus looking museum. And so I decided to like borrow, I think I brought in between 10 and 12 guitar amps and set them up on different floors of the museum around, and did the same kind of thing where I'd go around the museum turning on. And so, in order to fill that space, that was like the only way I could figure out how to do it. And he had like 4 screens. So we were just like maximalism, because you kind of had to in that context to be heard and seen.
With everybody's bodies in there as well, and the acoustics.
Yeah.
Great.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of times it became more of a social event. There's people like hanging out and talking, and that's human nature. And so we, in order to kind of like force people into consuming the performance, that was how we decided to pull it off. And I did that one time in LA when I first moved there at Human Resources. I don't know if you know that space. They're not really active as much these days with music. It's more of an art, focusing on visual art.
Yeah, the name rings a bell. I don't know if I've ever been, but yeah.
It's in Chinatown, and it's also like a big warehouse space with a huge ceiling.
Gotcha.
Drums sound awful there. And like drummers would come in and just play their drums how they would play their drums, and it would just sound awful. But then there are other percussionists who would factor that in and knew how to use the space. And so I did that piece there and brought in some amps. And after that, I was like, I'm never doing that again unless I have a roadie or somebody to help me carry and pick up amps. And because I had to pick them up and I had to drop them off, and I had to brutal.
It's a whole thing. And you gotta get the tapes, and that takes up a lot of room too. We're using 90-minute tapes or 60-minute tapes, or
it really
kind of a mixture?
I was using sometimes 30-minute sides of a tape, and I would just have a loop on that whole side. And so if I knew I was going to do a shorter version, I would use like the 30-minute on each side, and other times I'd use like 60-90-minute tapes. But I was basically bouncing loops to tapes. That was time consuming as well. Really fun piece to do as a like performer, especially, and to like interact with the audience in a different way. And it just got to the point where it was like so easy to do. It was very easy to travel with, which was awesome, taking it on tour to Europe and just having all I needed in a backpack, as opposed to 2 Pelican cases full of like synths and pedals and stuff. It became like really I wasn't getting satisfaction out of it as much, because it was like I could do it like in my sleep kind of thing. Well, the problem was like trying to record it and have a good recording of it never quite worked, because it was like you could never capture a recording that really translated well to a stereo mix, because it's sort of a surround piece. So tried to do that and released like a live CD I did in Chicago of it on the radio, and they had like 6 mics set up, and that was like the best version, recorded version of it. But yeah, after like 4 years of doing it, I kind of had to move on. And that's kind of when my band Day Palms kind of came about. Just I needed to do something different. Was tired of making electronic music. And I wanted to do something new, and I certainly didn't know how to like make the kind of music Day Palms made. So, from a learning standpoint, it was really rewarding. Kind of getting that sense of naivete again, where I like when I was starting out making electronic music, I didn't know what I was doing. Something very refreshing about it. You're just like going off intuition, and as opposed to like I know how all this works, and so I have to do this, and this to make it sound this way, and to going back into like a learning experience while making the music, which was really awesome.
Yeah, definitely a change of pace.
Yeah, and I'm not
in the way that you're making music. Yeah,
there's like I have artists, musicians who kind of have their thing, and that's what they do, and they do it for 30 years, and they're amazing at it, and it's great. And then there are other artists like myself who just like have to move on to different things because we get restless, or and that for better or for worse. Sometimes I think for worse, because it's less output when you're always like trying something new and having to develop it and spend oftentimes like 1.5 to 2 years developing something before you feel comfortable bringing it out to the world. Whereas if you're doing the same thing for 20 years, 30 years, it's clockwork, and you just go and do it, muscle memory. But that's where I just kind of went from like solo performer to being in a duo and making just like the kind of music that I wanted to hear, and using all the influences geographically, and classical Indian music especially was a big part of it. And being able to like merge weird influences that you would never consider, like, I'm the band Ohm, which is like doom metal, minimalism, like just bass and drums, and that's with like Alice Coltrane, or like Miles Davis fusion, like that kind of stuff. Henry Flint. Those are like the 4 artists that kind of form the idea.
Really pulling from a lot of different perspectives,
yeah, I mean,
and collections and stuff. Yeah, genres even. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I'm always like most inspired by artists like Don Cherry, who would perform with musicians from all over the world, mixing genres and styles, and that's always really interesting to me. Not easy to pull off, but that's it was like really being able to have those influences and really feel like they all are in the music one way or another. The Henry Flint, like minimalism with the violin playing through an amp and using that distortion, is there, like using a tempura and playing it almost like a bass line is in there for Alice Coltrane. Because usually the tempura is just a steady drone that kind of forms a nice sound environment. But one of her songs, I think her album with Joe Henderson, one of the tracks, the tempura is being played like a upright bass almost, and playing like a line rhythmically. And so that, I mean, that all, so I would say, in summing, like the acoustic ensemble performance, tape chants, and then like working with Day Palms are like my 3 proudest and like most influential musical experiences. Absolutely. It's like easy for me to, now that I have all these years, down the line, looking back, it's like if I stopped making music today, I'd still feel really happy with that output.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I wouldn't be too stoked on all those achievements, but whatever. I mean, it's one.
Hey, like I of course like haven't, have other goals and stuff that I may never reach. Trying to, but you got to reach for the prize. And
That's definitely true. Yeah. I want to talk to you about this performance. I've only read about it. I wanted to ask you about it, that you
yeah.
performed at the what was it, the Battery Townsley up in
Oh yeah.
Marin. How did that
Yeah.
come about?
Um,
Oh, and
that,
real quick, just so for people who know or
yeah.
who don't know, it was a station.
Yeah. It
Station's probably the wrong word, but that it was
was a
built.
bunker.
But yeah, a bunker. That thank you, a bunker to protect the Californian coast during the
Yeah.
World War II, and that's so crazy that you were able to play
From,
there.
yeah, from like submarines and
Mm-hmm.
off the coast, which were definitely spotted. Yeah, it was this, there's several of the batteries like throughout the headlands on the cliff overlooking the Pacific. And you can go, when I first moved to the Bay, I heard about like friends would go there and like record a saxophone in the big tunnel, and it would have like an 8-second reverb, and so musicians would often do that, and that's how like I heard about it. But then like really cool thing, the Bay Area was so awesome at this time period, which was like 2004 to 2012 ish.
A lot
Just
of
really
things going on
cool.
there. A lot of
Yeah,
different.
like festivals. And this was part of a festival. And got invited to perform in the Battery. And at that time, I was doing the Tape Chance piece, and it was like the perfect, um, like the perfect context for that piece was like a really crazy acoustic space.
And visually
That
too. I mean, to be there,
Yeah,
it's crazy.
I
Yeah.
think I might have the LP here, because I ended up releasing that performance um, on an Italian label, and
Is that the one that's on your Bandcamp, by the way? Just real
yeah,
quick,
I
so
think
people know.
so. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, yeah.
gotcha.
And it's like got the photo of the entrance to the Battery. It's just like perfect square. You could see the end through it, and yeah, and so the audience, they set up chairs inside the Battery, and I would set up the cassette players all like around inside that space and just started turning them on, and it was crazy.
I bet. I mean,
The
that's just a wild
recording,
thing. Yeah.
the stereo recording again can only do so much to how it was in the moment, like acoustically, and how the audience heard it. Like totally different experience. But yeah, that being able to perform in those kind of spaces around the Bay Area, Europe, was like the one of the coolest part of performing that piece, and others. But yeah, it was an amazing space, and it meant a lot to me. My grandfather was in World War II, and I studied World War II quite a bit, but like mostly on the Eastern Front. And this was in the States, dealing more with like Japan and sometimes Germany submarines, as far as it's, I think. And so being able to perform in this World War II bunker was meaningful in that way as well. But very inspiring space. I wish I could remember the name of the festival. I'm not sure if it's still active, but they did that performance there, and then they also had other spaces like a cathedral in San Francisco. They had performances at, and some other spaces as well. But yeah, the Battery Townsley was awesome. I kind of forgot about that. That was like 2011, I think. That was really cool.
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
I bet. I mean, that's just such an odd place, and such a. I mean, so just a place that you wouldn't think that you would be able to
Yeah.
play, or
Yeah. I
people
mean,
would
as far as
play.
I know, they just like went to the park rangers and were like, "Hey, we want to do this. Is this possible?" And the rangers were so cool. They were they were in there as well during the performance, and I'm sure like they never saw anything or heard anything like that, just based on like how non-traditional it was. And they're just like, yeah, and the audience had to walk up the mountain to get there, and there's fog, and it was just like this really cool cool environment. And I think like actually now that I'm thinking about it, Date Palms ended up doing an outdoor all acoustic show, not at that battery, but at another one outside of it. Um, so got to play around up there a couple times, and that was a great part of the Bay was just had the openness for spaces to open up to have weird music played, you know, in these World War II bunkers. But they, you know, they were really happy to, you know, expose more people to it, and the Marin Headlands in general, like just like from an educational standpoint. So it was very, very cool, and definitely miss those that time period, because that was a really influential period in the Bay Area too. At that time, like mid 2000s to like 2012, 13, before gentrification and everybody started to leave and things shifted to LA actually. And that, you know, that, and then LA started to get gentrified and expensive, and now that's in a transition, I think, as well. One of the reasons I was, you know, ready to go was, I mean, definitely the quarantine and how it was affecting my mental well-being, but also just like, you know, when I live somewhere, I take so much of it, my surroundings, like probably that's the most influential part of my music, is like where I happen to be living at the time is going to be in the music. Like even if it's subtle or not direct, it's in there, whether it was like having this really thick, heavy ambient music that I was making in Florida, humid, you know, the air, to like noisier, like noise distortion influence music I was making in Oakland, you know, from just like the industrial aspect of that city and the noise scene there at the time. And then in LA, just like sun, palm trees to my last solo record, all heavily influenced like my music, for better or
Yeah.
for worse.
It's up to the listener to decide. No,
Yeah,
no, that it's
absolutely.
all great, and I'm glad that you mentioned your last album, which was L'Orange, right?
Yeah.
First of all, where did that name come about? I mean, like, were you kind of thinking about using that as a title for a track or for the album itself? How did that come about?
Yeah. That will Having grown up in Miami and then having moved, when I was just working on that album, I had just moved to LA, and which is very similar to Miami, which sounds weird, but really is.
Climate wise, and then you said that you had the mountains and the
Right. But
ocean. Yeah.
even like, I mean, yeah, Florida's flat, no mountains, but like the palm trees, the sun, like the Hollywood scene is like analogous to the South Beach scene in Miami, you know, being one that you try and avoid generally. But culturally and like, and just, you know, geographically and all, you know, when I was working on that album, it was really like where I come from and where I'm living now, became the basis for the album. And like, as far as like song titles and album titles and band names, for me, it's really like how it flows off your tongue, what it looks like on paper. And I just liked the way it sounded and looked. And I like mixing religious imagery or languages, and so
Pulling from
that's
a lot
kind
of
of,
different points and
yeah,
making
I think
something of it.
so.
Yeah.
I
And
think
that's
so.
fantastic. I mean, you could really hear it in the album, and it's incredible. I really do
Oh,
like
thanks,
it.
man.
I'm not really. Oh, sorry about that. This thing keeps on jumping around here. You can still hear me though, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wanted to make sure you could hear me because this is a great compliment. No, I really do like it, and it's not really my forte, this ambient
Sure,
acoustic, and
sure.
this is a great jumping off point, and it's kind of it's really I don't know, I've taken a likening to it, and it was
Oh,
through your
cool,
music, so I mean it was really really great, and I
cool,
just
man.
want to make sure that the people know that it's you. It's L'Orange is you.
That is indeed, and like I grew up with like the literal component, like I grew up with orange and grapefruit trees in my backyard as a kid, and where I was living in Oakland, I had an orange tree on my porch. So obviously it was just in the back of my head. And like a lot of my music in the early days had like a darkness to it with like a little bit of, you know, light at the end of the tunnel or hope. And as I got older, it's like I got the darkness. I want to make, I need to make like happy music at this point in my life. And so, and I just moved to LA. It was new and exciting and sunny and warm, um, and that, you know, that, and so that in combination with like the sounds I was using and the like chord, you know, chords I was using were all very like melodic and not dissonant or dark, tonally. Um, and started like working on that stuff right when I was leaving Oakland, but like it was really like my LA, my love letter to Miami and Los Angeles, really. You know, that was like, for me, that's what that album is. And like that album more so than any, for certainly more so than any of my solo work, was like, I think the most, like the whole thing was the most me, because I did the album art by my, you know, I did the album art, all the music. And so it was just like my, like a, you know, a nice artistic statement, and just fueled by like the move to Los Angeles, and moved back down to Miami for the time being, uncertain. I don't know, you know, if I'm gonna end up staying here indefinitely, but now I'm working on the follow-up to that record. And you know, definitely that record was pretty much like a synth record. There's a lot of like all the synths, it was just like analog synths and sine waves and stuff. Whereas like what I'm doing now, it has that, but also using some acoustic instruments as well, which I'd done earlier. But because I moved and I sold a lot of my equipment when I left Oakland, I really didn't have a lot to work with. And so it was kind of
minimalism, kind of in a sense.
Yeah, you know, like I that's kind of the music I'm drawn to, or the art I'm drawn to, and the music I make, like doing a lot with a little, I like, which, you know, you would think is easy, but really isn't. To, you know, you can't really get away with like a sine wave for 40 minutes without any movement. So it's always challenging to do. So
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely. And when I wrap this up, I want to
yeah, man.
do some promos for you. So you can buy L'Orange on mexicansummer.com, and you can also find your Looking Glass
Oh yeah, that
EP
was fun.
also as well, and Tape Chance and the rest of your discography on or at greggkowalsky.bandcamp.com, right? That's where the people should go
Yeah,
to find
man.
it.
Well, thank you so
Great.
much.
I have one more thing for you real
Yeah,
quick.
no, I'm no rush.
Yeah, and you can find Date Palms music at
Yeah.
datepalmsofpsalms.com, which I highly recommend as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, that's my like band's not really electronic music, although we use like some synths. The instrumentation is was bass, like fuzz bass, Fender Rhodes, violin, flute, electronics, and some like harp string instruments as well. So it's definitely like, you know, it's driven by the bass and the Fender Rhodes primarily. So it's like rhythmic, which my solo stuff generally isn't too rhythmic. And it's, you know, and like I make electronic music, but it, like for the, like I've pretty much been listening to 70s music for the last like long while. And so that's kind of where my head's at, and has been for a while. Even though my solo stuff kind of comes from electronic music, that's more of like a band with like a, you know, electric bass and Fender Rhodes amplified, and the violin through a guitar amp. So it's pretty heavy, and also very meditative, but like in a really nice way. And I miss making that music. That was like really fun stuff to make.
Yeah, definitely. And also the listeners should look out for your new album whenever it's out, and
Yeah,
you'll be promoting that, right?
absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah. that is what's happening. So I've been going out and recording manatees and frogs and alligators. So we'll see what happens on this next album.
Oh wow, it's gonna be great. Yeah,
I don't
awesome.
know. Yeah,
Pulling from nature.
or there was just recordings I made to meditate to while like listening to these animals underwater, which was awesome.
That's great, and I can't wait to listen to it. And thank you so much for being
Yeah,
on.
man.
I really
Thank you.
appreciate it, Greg. Also,
Awesome.
I'll talk to you one second. I'm just gonna stop
All
recording
right, man.
this. Awesome.
Sweet.
Thank you, man.